Hello, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm so excited for you to join us and for you to be able to be a part of this conversation with us. Today, we're going to have a much needed talk. When I came across this book and was reached out about the title, it immediately drew my attention because I believe it's so important and such an important conversation for this time. So, if you're coming in, share this live. If you're watching it later, hello. We look forward to you just chiming in and learning more about not only the writer, but also the editor that will be joining us today as we discuss call and response. In the chat, you can put your name, any questions that you may have as we're talking, because I have my own curated questions. But as we're talking, I will be checking the chat as people are, I see, starting to log in. And if you have a question that you would like to be posed, I will ask it throughout the interview. So as you see at the bottom, today is our author story time, or which we like to call it the front row. And today we have Jen Harlan along with Wesley Turner. And we will be talking about an amazing book that, as you see at the bottom, you need to go and purchase, add it to your home library, make it a part of a conversation piece for you and your family. So before we jump in, we're going to actually do our introductions first. I'm going to read both of their bios, and if there's anything they would love to add, we'll give them that opportunity, and then we'll jump right into our conversation. So, for our first person that we will be interviewing today is Jennifer Harlan. She is a staff editor on the Special Projects Desk at the New York Times. She is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller "Finish the Fight: The Brave and Revolutionary Women Who Fought for the Right to Vote," which was named a Best Book of the Year by the Washington Post, the New York Public Library, and others, and selected as a 2020 honor book by the Jane Addams Peace Association. She is a graduate of Brown University. She is from Louisville, Kentucky, and currently resides in Brooklyn. When she's not writing about the unusual histories of roller derby, private eyes, or women's suffrage for the Times, she can usually be found baking pies or searching for her next great karaoke song. And I don't know if we're going to be doing the karaoke today. We're going to preserve.
Unfortunately, I don't have much of a karaoke voice right now, but
Right.
once my voice is back, I'm looking forward to that.
I love it. I love it. And thank you, Jen, for being here. We also have Wesley Turner, who is the senior editor at the Versified imprint of HarperCollins. She edits books for all ages, including most recently the middle grade nonfiction book Call and Response: The Story of Black Lives Matter. And that is what we're here to discuss today. And I also love the diversity of the works. I'm sure you see a lot of different books that come across your desk, huh, Wesley?
Oh, absolutely. Something for everyone, I would think.
Yes, yes. So we're gonna just go right into what I love to just see like your personal journey before we get into the book and just some of the main points that I know that people are desperate to listen to. I just want to know like the journey of becoming a writer. Then how did you get to this space? We kind of heard your background of Louisville to now Brooklyn, but a part of that, what led you to this love of writing?
Well, I think like a lot of writers, I started off as a reader. I was always, as a kid, from a very, very young age, I loved books. I was especially into historical fiction and fantasy, anything that let me sort of explore another world, another person's point of view from a book. And I also always loved making up stories. Like if I was playing with, was big on like had my dollhouse and all of the dolls had like extensive backstories and relationships. Like I was always making up stories for them. And it wasn't really until I got older, really until like I would say probably college, when I realized that I could write stories that I still like. I love fiction, both as a reader and occasionally as a writer, but what I really do now is write nonfiction. And in college is really when I fell in love with writing stories that were true. I love getting to talk to someone and find out about their story and their life, whether they're someone who owns a bookstore in Paris or someone who makes coffee and makes amazing work with latte art, or someone who is an activist in their community who's working to improve access to clean food or clean water, or like those are some of like the earliest stories that I think I worked on as a journalist. But that was when I found that I could talk to someone, I could find out their story, which I love to do, and then I could use the tools in my toolbox, which is that I'm a writer, and I could write that story down and share it. When I get excited about a story or a person, whether it's someone from history or someone today, I then want to share it. And I think everyone should learn about who they are. And so that's what I try and do as a writer, is find the people that I'm excited about, that I hadn't heard about, that most people haven't heard about, and then share those stories with the world.
Love it. And then Wesley, as I was just talking about, just seeing so many stories come across your desk. So I'm really big about our children and our families learning about all the aspects of what gets a book into their hand, right? And so we definitely have our illustrators, our publishers, our authors, but I feel like editors have such an important role of really making sure the voice is heard the way the author wanted to be heard, and just also making sure that the story just really conveys the message throughout. So I would say the same thing that I just asked Jen. What led you to, this career of being an editor?
I think everyone who's in the job has some link to a love of books, right? So I grew up, with a mother who introduced me to Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou and Zora Neale Hurston through their books, and a father who wanted me to be just as aware of the stories of, The Hobbit and, Star Trek and Star Wars. So in my mind, my imagination could do anything. And the worlds that were open to me, just by picking up a book, there was no limit. So when I, left college and was looking for what I wanted to do next, I started to think about my love of books and the ways that I could incorporate that into my life. And I was working at a bookstore, trying to get a sense of, well, how would I get involved with the making of books in a way that's different from the writing side of things. And then, trying to be an editor, just clicked, especially knowing that Toni Morrison, worked as an editor of adult books. I was just drawn to the idea that I could help create stories and help other people tell their stories. And I would say that the children's part of it came about quite by accident. It was just the first job that I got was in the children's book industry. But in retrospect, it makes a lot of sense when I think about my favorite books over time and the fact that I'm the oldest of four and read a lot of books to my younger siblings. It makes sense in retrospect that this is what I would have done.
Yeah, I love that. And I love just stating like the common thread is like this love of reading, right? And so I think that reading in many ways, which we'll get to, is aligning you and opening you up to a world that you didn't even know was possible, and also being able to learn the stories of people that matter, right? As Jen, you said earlier. So I would love for my next question, what inspired you to write this book? What was the draw to Call and Response, the story of Black Lives Matter? Like, why did that story matter to be written at this time?
So I first just want to give a huge shout out to Veronica Chambers, who is the lead author, my co-author on this book, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. But this book started, as you mentioned, when you were introducing us. Veronica and I had worked together on a book that came out last summer called Finish the Fight, which was about the history of the women's suffrage movement and the fight for women's right to vote in this country. And as a part of that book, we looked a lot at the history of voting rights and the way that even though the 19th Amendment, which established women's right to vote in the United States, was ratified in 1920, the conversations that the suffragists were having this fight for access to our democracy did not stop. In that year, it has kept going, and particularly for people of color, has continued to be an ongoing struggle. So we were thinking about these topics and about how to write about them and talk about them with young people. And then George Floyd was murdered, and we were seeing, as journalists and also as people, the protests that were happening all across the country, all around the world. And we're thinking about how it was hard even for us as adults and as journalists to kind of process what was happening, and also to contextualize it and think about how we had gotten to this point as a country, as a people, and where we go from here. And so that question of like, what is Black Lives Matter? how did we get to this place? What are the issues that activists the people are protesting about, the people are fighting for? How do you get involved? What is the role of young people in those protests? All of those questions are what led to this book. And we, in particular, as journalists, part of our job is to kind of write the first draft of history. And so we wanted to write the book in this moment while things were still happening, to kind of capture that lightning in a bottle moment in a way that couldn't be like colored, or someone couldn't say like, oh, well, that's not how it happened. That isn't really what happened, or that wasn't really that important. We wanted to be able to say, no, this is happening right now. We're talking to the people who are on the streets, the activists, the journalists who are covering it. And we also, you can't see from the cover of this book, but so much of the book is photographs that were taken by photojournalists at the Times and other outlets of what was happening in the streets. And we really wanted to capture that and put it in a book so that you could see this is what happened, and also to then kind of bring all of our like experience and resources as journalists, as researchers, as writers, to zoom out and look at the history that led us to this point, and also questions about like what this moment means and how we might move forward from there.
Yeah, and that's just perfect to just segue to like, Wesley, what would you say? What does this moment mean? Like, why is this book so important in these certain current times, right? Like, why to you do you feel like it's so important that we have this conversation?
So one of the really interesting things about where I have been during this pandemic is that when everything kicked off in March, my parents sort of reached out to all of their children and brought us back home under their skirts, basically. So I have been living in sort of a multi-generational situation for over a year now. We've got, my parents, the boomers, we've got the millennials, myself, my sister, and my partner, and then we have the Gen Z, my younger siblings and their cousins. And so we had a very interesting family conversation at one point about, which historical events do you remember living through? And I had this whole moment where I had to realize that the way that the younger people in my life understood 9/11 was completely different from the way that I understood 9/11 and the things around it, which became, much more relevant when we, sort of got to the point of talking at the dinner table about the withdrawal from the war in Afghanistan. But one of the things it reminded me of is how much there is a gap in your education. You get to the end of your US history class or the end of your world history class, and you only get up to a certain point a couple decades ago. And then everything between then and what you've lived through, you sort of got to glean on your own. And partly because that history is still being written. So I think it's so important to have history of recent, and current events. I think that having that record is really valuable for young people who may not, later have this as part of their class, but still need the context for how we are in this current moment. Yeah. So here, over a year after, the sort of height of the Black Lives Matter protests, young people still need to know what happened last summer and how it is still affecting what's going on today, and how all of that has roots much, much farther back.
Yes, I totally agree. And if you're just joining us or tuning in, we're talking from Idea to Publication. How did this amazing book, Call and Response, the story of Black Lives Matter, come to be? And one of the things that you said is that it's so important that we are not only looking at our world and seeing what's currently happening, but just the relationship of prior events, right? And just like also the role we play in it, because it's going to dictate what the future events are, right? And as you just shared, just being at home with your family during this time, I feel like we've all had to kind of figure out where do we fit in these current times. I mean, as a parent, I have a 10-year-old son, and this has been a very interesting year. Just explaining to him, you're at home, we're during a pandemic. I mean, all these different things are occurring on top of all these different racial ignited things that we've seen happen around the world. And I think it's just so important because some of the things we don't know how to articulate, but I think it goes perfect to what you will be doing with the book, which is showing storytelling through illustration, right? I think some of the things that we're going to look back in history and look in history books, there's just imagery that will never leave our minds, right? Or there are going to be pictures and moments that really stand out. And whether my son's children see it, as you said, like the millennials, they're going to be able to feel as if they were a part of that moment, right? Of what was happening in history. And so I would love for you to kind of speak to, either or, why was the decision made to make it kind of like quotes and photos and not just a straight narrative, right, type book? Whose decision was to incorporate all those different mediums?
That's a really good question. One of the interesting things about, working on this book is I came on board after it had actually been, formally acquired, and was thrilled to be working on the project. So to some degree, it seems to me like a no-brainer that if you are working with the New York Times and they have an incredible photojournalism, reputation and expertise, and you're telling a story about a current moment, it makes total sense to me that you would draw on that resource. But Jen, if there's something you want to add about how that came to be, I'm happy to hear
it. No, I think that's absolutely it. Veronica and I we met because we were working together on a project at the New York Times called Past Tense, where the Times has about 8 million photos that have been sitting in file cabinets in a basement, paper copies of these photos for decades. Basically languishing down there. And so this project that we worked on, the idea was to scan all of these photos and get them into a digital format where we could actually see what was down there. And then she and I and our colleagues were working on finding stories within the archives and telling stories using these photos. So she and I very much come from a place of knowing just how powerful a photograph can be. And especially, I think, when you're talking about history, and particularly with young people, I think there can be a tendency to feel like history is this like dusty thing this thing that happened a long time ago in a world that's very removed from your own, that only exists in like pictures and paintings or illustrations. But there's something about photographs that feels so vibrant and so human, and that really shows just how recent this history that we're talking about is. We go a lot into the book. We look a lot at the sort of the movements that led to Black Lives Matter, in particular the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement in the United States, because Black Lives Matter really draws on the history of both of those movements. And so we really wanted to show that this is not ancient history that we're writing about. This is history that happened within our lifetimes. You can go and talk to people in your family, in your community who are alive, who remember what it was like to live through that, just like young people are living through these historic moments now that they'll then tell their kids and their grandkids about. And so I think the photos were really powerful, at capturing what happened last summer, but also at bringing the history into it and helping it feel very vibrant and present for the reader.
I love it. So at this time, we're actually going to see these photos that we've been talking about. As you are tuning in and watching, like I said in the chat, if you have any reactions or comments or a question you want to pose as they're going through the photos, please do. But I'm ready to just kind of sit back and watch as well, just at the selections that were chosen for today. So on the screen, you'll see some images that are directly pulled from the book. And then we're going to just kind of talk through what's the story behind it and why it mattered.
Yeah, so I have to find my mouse so that I can scroll through the photos. There we go. So like I said, start off looking at what we really wanted to do and to use, as Leslie mentioned, the Times is lucky enough where we have some of the best photojournalists in the world, and they were all over the country and also all over the globe documenting the protests that were happening last summer. And so we really wanted to draw on their work and what they had seen to capture that in the book, this moment where 15 to 26 million people around the world came out and participated in some sort of protest or demonstration for Black Lives Matter, which makes it the largest protest movement in the history of the country. And I think you can see that and really see the power of that moment in the photos. You see people all over. This is a protest in New York from last summer. This is one in DC. And what you'll see in these is not just the number of people, but also the diversity of these protests, that you had people of all ages, of all races, of all backgrounds, abilities, people from all different kinds of communities who were coming together and saying, this Black Lives Matter this is not a Black people problem, a Black people movement. This is an American problem. This is a human problem. That people are being murdered, people are losing their lives. And it's something that affects all of us, that we all need to be invested in and all need to come together to find a solution for. And so you can really see that this is a protest in Minneapolis where George Floyd was killed. We also, one of the things we were really struck by in the protest that we wanted to make sure was reflected in the photos in the book was how important young people were as a part of this movement. And that's been true of Black Lives Matter since the very beginning. When the Alicia Garza, Opal Tomeni, and Patrisse Cullors founded Black Lives Matter, they were all young women themselves. And it's a movement that from the very beginning has been really driven by young people, and that has really valued the voices and contributions of people of all ages. One of my favorite stories and conversations that we got to have for the book was with a family in Los Angeles. Melina Abdullah, who is one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, which is one of the oldest chapters in the country. It was one of the first ones to start. And her daughters, Tendiwe and Amara, both of whom have really been raised in this movement. I think Amara said she went to her first protest when she was 2 or 3 years old. And it was really important to Melina as they were starting this chapter of Black Lives Matter, that it was a space where families were welcome, where children were welcome, where everyone's voice was valued. And Tendiwe told us this amazing story about when she was, I think, 7 or 8 years old. She and her mom went to Ferguson, Missouri to participate in the protest there after Mike Brown was killed. They had a group that went from Los Angeles. They rented a bunch of vans to drive across the country. Tendiwe was the youngest. The oldest person in their group was a man in his 80s. This whole generations of people who were going to protest together. And before they went, they decorated the vans, they painted them, they wrote Black Lives Matter and slogans, they wrote the names of people who had been killed. They started driving across the country, and people were honking, people were rolling down their windows to throw things at the vans, to yell slurs at them. And so eventually they pulled over to this gas station, and the adults in the group said, look, this is too dangerous. We need to just wash the paint off the vans, drive the rest of the way, and then we can put it back on when we get there. And Tendiwe, who was a kid, stood up and said, no, the whole point of a protest, the whole reason we're doing this and showing up is to start this conversation, to say you can't ignore these people or these issues. This is something that we need to talk about and that we need to change. And the adults in the group listened to her, and they left the paint on the vans, and as they drove all the way across the country to Missouri. And that to me was really emblematic of one of the things that's been really special, and part of what has made Black Lives Matter as a movement so powerful and effective is the way that it really, the founders of the movement talk a lot about it being leaderful and not having one person or a few people who are sort of the voices for the whole movement, but that this is a movement by the people and for the people, and everyone's voice matters. And we wanted that to be reflected in the photos.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say, Jen, that you said that really stood out to me is one, this reminder that it's youth-led, right? So a lot of times when we think about many of the movements in history, it was started and ignited by youth, right? And a lot of times even the leaders chose to bring in youth and empower youth to be able to be that voice. And I think that's so important even now that it's so much more announced that that's what Black Lives Matter, and to be honest, any other movement needs to be young, needs to be led by the youth. And I just wonder, I don't want to bypass that. I would love to kind of pause and Weslie just hear, why do you think that's the reason that many of these movements are so reliant on youth? Like even the story you just said, there's just a sense of, I would say my view is why, and I would love to hear Weslie. I think there's just you don't really fear, right? I think as a child, you're like, look, it's either black or white. It is what it is. Like I think about even my son, I said he's 10 and he's very like, no, that's not right. We're not doing it. Don't do it. You know what I mean? Like it's and he hasn't had enough of like, I have to conform to you yet. You know what I'm saying? It's a lot of like, it just isn't right. I don't care who it is. It just isn't right. And then it's not until I think you get older that you're like, well, you don't want to hurt people's feelings. You know, you want to make sure, you know, but at that point in life, it's like, well, if it's not right, then we don't do it. You know, so you know, Wesley, what do you think as she's going through these images? Why do you think, like, even here, the children are so pivotal in these movements?
I think comes down to the fact that you have to believe that change is possible in order to be working towards making change. And you have to believe that the way that we do things is not the way that things always need to be done. I think that a conversation that I have, you know, sort of in the multi-generational situation I'm living in is, you know, those of us who are younger express a lot of frustration about the way things are and why they have to stay the way that they were before we came along. And I think that, you know, there's a great chapter in the book that talks about the difference between inside and outside people who work within a movement, within a system to advance a cause, versus people who work outside the system to put pressure on that system. And I think that in either case, you know, when you are younger, when you have been told, you know, these ideas of right and wrong, and you have an innate sense of what should and should not be happening in the world, but are not yet old enough to have faced whatever letdowns make you believe that things will always be this way. Then you have the right combination of things to put that pressure on the systems you're within and the systems you're outside. And, you know, if you're lucky and you're young at heart, you keep that for as long as you can in your life. But I think that belief in the possibility of change is inherently necessary for these types of movements.
Yeah. Jen, this is an awesome picture. Where is this from?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. What you were saying about that having been true throughout history, that's something that we look at a lot in the book. And this photo right here is from a protest in the early 70s in New York. It was a student-led walkout protesting inequality in the New York City schools, which is something that continues to be an issue today. But there were actually more students, parents, teachers who walked out and participated in this protest than there were at the March on Washington. That's how big and how powerful this movement that was led and powered by young people was. And so, yeah, that's something that we really wanted to focus on in the book. We have a whole chapter that sort of looks back at the history of youth-led, youth-powered protests in this country, whether you look at the civil rights movement, if you look at anti-apartheid protests in the 70s, you look at the March for Our Lives and protest against gun violence, if you look at climate protests and the climate strikes today, all of these movements are really powered by young people. And I think your point is so true, Wesley, that part of it is that you haven't been kind of like, you're not jaded enough to have been like burned before by trying to make change and coming up against a institution or a system that is very resistant to change. And I think it's also that you're invested, like the future that's going to be shaped by the changes that are made, like that's your future. And so young people in some ways are more invested than anyone else in making sure that we do change the way that we do things, because they want the world that they are left with to be better than the one that we're living in today. This is a photo from the March on Washington, and something that was really striking to us about this is that you see that sign up at the front, "We demand an end to police brutality now." And one of the things that really struck us as we were researching and writing the book, and that we really wanted to be clear, is that I said, like, this is not, none of these are new conversations, or this is not a new struggle. This all exists in a continuum, and is part of that stretches throughout the entire history of the United States. And there's a man who we talked to who lives in Oregon, who was a member of the Black Panthers, who was out in the 60s and 70s protesting in his community against police brutality and trying to fight for citizen oversight of the police department there, so that when the cops did kill someone, it wasn't just up to the cops to discipline them or to try and make change, but that people in the community were able to stand up and say, no, this is wrong. We're not going to put up with this. And he last summer was still in the streets marching and protesting, and still in the same fight. This is a photo from a protest in New York last summer, which was a bike protest. It was all cyclists. It was something that we really wanted there to be a lot of entry points in this book for a lot of different kinds of kids, whether you're someone who's really engaged and love and extroverted and wants to be in the streets chanting and marching with lots of people, or if you're a kid who isn't as comfortable doing that, who isn't quite sure how to start these conversations, whether you're someone who's into riding your bike or skateboarding or surfing or baking or making music or making art, that there are lots of different things that protest can look like. There are lots of different ways to advocate for the cause that's important to you. So we have examples in the book of cyclists. We have a whole chapter about music and its role in protest, going all the way back to the earliest days of this country and spirituals, and up through looking at soul, at jazz, at all kinds of and artists like Kendrick Lamar, Janelle Monáe today, who are using their music to draw attention to issues that are important to them and to take a stand. We have a whole chapter about art, and especially a section on murals and how important those are. Those can be both as creating a place for a community to gather. This is in Louisville, Kentucky, which is where I'm from and where Breonna Taylor was killed last year. And this art piece became a gathering place for the community and also a sort of staging ground for protests. And murals can be a really powerful way to document what's happening, to express your views. And one thing that really struck us about all of the murals that we included in the book is that almost all of them were created by some sort of community, some sort of group, whether it was a father and daughter in Kansas who did a mural together, or a group of students in Oakland who got together and painted a mural, or a group of students in Chicago who painted Black Lives Matter on a street in their neighborhood, or even kids who just took some sidewalk chalk and made street murals that way that would get washed away with the rain, but were there for a moment. That it really sort of emphasized for us that what makes protest work, what makes it so powerful, is when people come together, and that the power of the people is greater than the people in power, and that when enough people come to and stand together and say, we want this to change, then that can't be denied.
Yep.
One of my other favorite sections in the book is we took a story that our Metro team at the Times actually did called The Anatomy of a Protest and turned it into a chapter in the book. And what we really want to do is you look at those pictures of those big crowds and it just looks like a mass of people. We wanted to kind of zoom in and break that down a little bit and look at, how does a protest happen? Like, it's not like a bunch of people, 100,000 people just show up in a street. Someone has to tell them when it's happening. Someone has to decide where to go. And so we broke down all of the different roles and all the work that goes into making a protest happen. So you have the marshals who are leading the way and organizing the parade. You have the bike brigade that's stopping cars, blocking traffic, and helping plan out the route. You have medics who are there to help if people need it. You have legal observers. You have people who are supply people who are bringing water bottles and snacks, or in the case of last summer, masks and things like that people might need, and really break down for people how exactly a protest happens. I think this is our last photo, and Veronica talks a lot about how books have architecture. We think about them like building a house. And so we were really specific with this book about how we built this book. We wanted to present the full history, and we didn't want to sugarcoat or gloss over anything, because obviously the history of Black Lives Matter and what has inspired and what this movement has grown out of is a lot of human lives that have been lost, and a lot of tragedy and violence and death. And we wanted to present that full history, but in a way that was approachable and honest, while not being inaccessible for young people. And so we spend the whole first half of the book really setting up, how did we get to this moment, both in terms of the history of Black Lives Matter specifically, and then also zooming out and looking at the history of systemic racism in this country, and things like how it affects things like housing and schools, and how much like money your family has, and also how it affects like policing and things like that. And then we wanted to zoom out and look at, like I said, all the different forms that protest can take, whether it's music, whether it's sports, whether it's art. And then we really wanted to end the book on this note of looking towards the future. And we had this moment last summer that seemed like it could be really transformative. And so looking at what were the actual like policy changes or progress that has been made since then, and where do we go from here? And like those are questions that we were asking all the way up until we had to send the last pages of the book. I mean, Weslie can attest. we as journalists are used to like being able to make changes up until the last moment when the story publishes. And with books, you have to send it to the printer at some point so that they can read it. And we were like trying to squeeze, like add stuff in and squeeze things in and change things up until the last minute, because we were really struggling with how do you tell a story that's still happening in real time, and also how do you end a book about a story that's still ongoing.
Yeah, and I would just add that in terms of book publishing meets newspaper publishing, those different timelines are something that we work against, throughout the process, because you have different mindsets when you're like, pushing something that will, be out there the next day versus when you're pushing something that, has to go to an overseas printer, and, especially for books that are, in full color, and then come back over by boat. And there's a whole series of supply chain issues, which I'm sure that, everyone is experiencing to some degree as we start to like look towards our holiday presents and things like that. And one of the important things to us was making sure that, we did this book in the highest quality possible, and that we, positioned it for the best possible success. So making sure that we could address, in an author's note, here's, where we were at the time this went to the printer, and here's, what's still to come, was very important. But also making sure that we got this out and on the shelves was very important. And the one other thing I'll add about the photographs is, you may notice as you look through a lot of photographs that were very stunning, and some of them, had real cover potential. And as Jen alludes to, the cover of the book doesn't necessarily show you the wealth of the photos that are inside. It was a real challenge to try to distill this movement down into one photo, and ultimately we decided against doing it because there are many facets to both the wealth of information that's in the book and to the movement itself. So when you pick this up, and you look inside and suddenly see all of that vibrant color, you'll get a sense of all of the work that went into this. But the cover sort of reflects more of the specifics of, what it is we're talking about. Let's focus on, at the end of the day, it all comes back to Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. One thing you'll also notice if you look really closely at the cover, the words that are inside the title, those are taken from letters, from speeches, from songs, from chants, going all the way back through the history that's covered in the book. I think the oldest one we have in there is something from Frederick Douglass from the early 1800s, and goes all the way up until things that people like John Lewis and Janelle Monáe were saying in 2020 today. And so we really wanted to show they said that this is not an isolated chapter, and the front of the book says this is the story of Black Lives Matter, and it is, but it's also about something so much bigger and so much longer reaching than that. And I was also just going to show, we snuck a bunch of photos
on the back
cover, but we couldn't, it was, I think maybe one of the hardest decisions we had to make was the cover on the book. We went back and forth so many times. And like Weslie said, we ultimately felt like there wasn't one photo that we could use that captured everything that this movement is about. And so that's why we went with the words.
And I'm just sitting here just taking in, and I actually like changed some questions based on this part, because I just feel like one of the things I read when I was reading through, and I look forward to getting the book. I'm so excited. But just from even hearing what you're sharing, this whole idea of like a hashtag to a movement, right? And I know that was something that was stated in the intro to this book. And I think about when we are working, because I work a lot with young people, they have a lot of energy and frustration and like wanting to do the next thing, but not necessarily knowing how to do it. And so I love the idea of like you just shared in the photos, like all the different ways that movement happens, right? Like movement isn't just being on the front lines with protest signs, but movement and just using your artwork as a movement, using your voice as a movement, using community, right? Using your family as a way to show, united fronts. And a lot of times, I think we've seen so many hashtags, and they're still being created. And a lot of times, unfortunately, they're usually for incident that ended in death, right, or ended in something terrible, and you don't know what to do to move past it. But I think the one thing about this Black Lives Matter and everything you're speaking to, of what, when we talk about what's happening currently, just things as far as like the George Floyd, all these things also happened when I think the world was made to pay attention to what's happening in America. You know what I mean? I think in that in itself changed the momentum. Like even when they were doing a lot of the protests leading up to after the killing of George Floyd, you saw, like you said, like people around the world were protesting. Like the fact of using a movement, using social media, right? Like using all these different mediums pulled more people in it. It made me think about even when I learned here in Chicago, we learned a lot about like the power of newspapers, like the Chicago Defender, and how the Chicago Defender was used to really tell people about what's happening in the North. You were removed from it, right? You moved and migrated to these different cities. But as a reminder, they were putting like the lynchings in the newspapers, all these different things, which was igniting people in different areas. And I think the same thing has happened with this Black Lives Matter. Like you got people in all around the world, literally, that put pressure on like, what are you all going to do to change what's happening in this situation? And so my question is now, like from this book, what would you both say is like the message to the world when it comes to Black Lives Matter? I think for so long it seemed like that's an American problem. That's a low income neighborhood problem. You know what I mean? But now I don't know. This is a world problem. So what would you say is like the message you would hope people get when they get this book?
Well, I would say what you just said is one of the most important parts of it, is that this is not a one community's problem. This is not this is not a Black people problem. This is not an America problem. This is not a certain parts of the country problem. This is everyone's problem. And so everyone needs to be talking about it and needs to be engaged in finding a solution. There's I mentioned that Veronica and I worked on this book about the suffrage movement, and one of my favorite suffragists had this quote that she would say a lot that was, "We are all bound up together." And that, I think, only when we all realize how interconnected we are and how much everyone's freedom depends on everyone else's freedom, only then can we work together towards having true justice and equity in a better world. And I think the other thing I would say is that it can be really easy when you're just one person in your community to feel like nothing you can do can really make a difference. And especially when we're talking about a movement like Black Lives Matter, it is long, slow, hard work to make change. It takes a really, really long time. It can be really discouraging. But what this movement and all the other movements that we talk about in this book really show is that you never know how the ripple effects that your one small action has, and protest and making change is cumulative. And so it may seem like a really small thing to you, but having a conversation with your family or with your neighbor, making a piece of art, writing a song, sharing a story, showing up to a protest, all of these things, it all works together. And everyone who is engaging in this work in whatever way they can, using whatever tools they have in their toolbox, it's by doing all of that together that we make change happen.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot there, so I'm reaching for what's left to say. What's interesting to me is I don't necessarily think of the book itself as having a message so much as the people that are interviewed in the book and the movement itself having a message, and those messages being varied and many. But I would say that if we're sending a message to the world with this book, for me it's about the power of information and the power of community, right? So as you were alluding to, it started with a hashtag, but it couldn't have sustained to continue to be around in 2020 for that moment that ignited so much more if people hadn't carried it forward, and more than one person. So I think the power of that community, both domestic and global, can't be underestimated, especially because social media has become a tool for us to connect in greater ways. And the other part of that is just that there is concrete factual information available about the issues of the day. I know that I've heard a lot of people talk about how it's much harder to say to a kid, oh, just Google it, because the links you get when you Google a very basic thing are no longer the most reputable or the ones that are from trusted sources. Mm-hmm. So where do we turn for information? And there are people doing a lot of great work about recent history, about current trends. There are books that can speak to you about the topics that you want to learn about, or about the topics that you keep hearing about but aren't quite sure what they are, or the topics that you have a reaction when you hear the name, but do you really know what's behind it? To me, the message is the information and the availability of it. And especially as we approach the holidays and the end of the year, I think that when we get to a point where we can clear out some time for ourselves to sit and read, or to figure out what we're going to hand to the young people in our lives, I think that this book is a great candidate for providing some concrete information at this point in time when disinformation is rife, and when concrete information can seem hard to find.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I'd say we wrote this book for young people, but we also really wrote it to hopefully be a resource for parents and teachers and librarians and other people who are having these conversations with the young people in their life, and who either want to be able to give them a source of accurate information with context, or want that information for themselves. And so we hope that there's a lot in this book for readers for all ages and ways to start conversations. It's also part of the reason why we've included a pretty extensive bibliography in the back and a further reading list, so that if you want to continue the conversation about Ferguson, about redlining, about bike and surf protests, any of these points, that they're accurate, reputable sources that we have used in our own research that we're now sharing with you, so you can use this book as a jumping off point to then find out more.
And I know that I'm a biased, speaker on this point as a children's book editor, but I'm a big proponent of adults reading, nonfiction for young people, because, sometimes your brain isn't able to take the technical or academic version. But, we all can benefit from concrete, basic information, simply told.
Yeah, I agree.
I think something Veronica and I were talking about the other day too is, they say the best way to tell if you really know something is to have to explain it to a young person.
Yep.
And so we had to do so much research and so much reading and listening and having conversations to get to the point where we could write this book in a way that would be accessible and understandable to young people. And so our hope is, like you said, that this can also, that information is also useful for adult people, or any person who wants to know more about what's going on in our world and how we got to this point. So it's a middle grade book, but it's a book for all ages, really.
I love it. So as we kind of come to the close, I want two things to be stated. What are ways that people can continue to follow your work and what you have going on next? And then also, what do you have next going on? As far as, is there another book, in the works? Is there any exciting things happening next in our careers? How can people continue to follow both of you? And then what is happening next?
Jen, you want to go first?
Sure. So my day job when I'm not writing books is I'm an editor at the New York Times. And so the best way to follow my work is either look for my byline on their website. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. You can follow me there and find out about what I'm working on, and also what I'm baking and what art I'm seeing, and those fun things on Instagram. And in terms of what's next, Veronica and our team has been working on this series all year called Black History Continued, which is very much like an extension of this book. It's a a series of visual journalism looking at the people and moments that have shaped our culture and continue to. We just had, so we have, we've been working on this sort of mini series about Black people in the outdoors. We had an amazing story about Black surfers that came out a couple months ago, and a profile on Betty Reed Soskin, who is just turned 100. She's the oldest active park ranger in the United States and has led like the most amazing, fascinating life. I cannot recommend this story highly enough. She's
still a park ranger?
She's still a park ranger.
Wow.
She's still working. Yeah. at the Rosie the Riveter National Historic Park in out, which is in the Bay Area in California. Yeah, she is. But she worked. She was a singer earlier in her life. She like owned a record store. She's had like a million different lives, and is just an amazing woman. So I'm working on that series, and we have some great stories coming up about gardening and about the record number of Black women who are mayors of major cities in the U.S. right now, and working on some stuff I think about the Harlem Renaissance coming up for next year. So
these are all
stay
amazing
tuned for more of that.
Awesome. Yes.
That's great stuff. It's a little hard to follow the work of a book editor, but if you want to know more about books like this, you can look at the social media handles for my imprint, Versify. We're a small dedicated team. And if you go to @Versify Books on Twitter or Instagram, you'll see us posting all the time about the books that we're working on. I would say the next book that is most in the vein of this one, in terms of being, sort of nonfiction accessible for young people, would be The Anti-Racist Kid, which we're working on with #1 New York Times bestselling author Tiffany Jewell. So a different creative team. We have a great illustrator for that, Nicole Miles, who's Eisner nominated and just does absolutely the best job of creating an accessible guide, sort of in the vein of like Care and Keeping of You, but for, anti-racism and breaking down racism and what it all pertains to. But, if you're looking for something right now, Jen has also mentioned from this team, Finish the Fight, which is currently up for a Kids' Choice Award, I believe.
Wow, awesome.
If you've got young people in your life, or if you are a young person, you'll want to look at Finish the Fight. It's out in the world now, has been for over a year, and we're very happy about the work it does to explain, the suffrage movement and make it real for people who are living and working today.
I love it. I love it. Love it. Well, I wanted to say thank you so much for your time. This has been an amazing conversation. I look forward to both. I actually am already talking to, so I have a series of level book clubs here in Chicago. So we have book clubs for kids as young as 6 months all the way up to high school. The first group is with the babies and their parents. And I've already told my teachers, like, look, both of these books we got to incorporate this season. So I'll definitely be letting you know our kids' reaction to it as they're reading it, because we do have a middle school group that I'm going to have read this book. But thank you so much for your time and just for your heart in this work. I can just tell that you're really passionate about it. And I think that that's what matters as well. Not only the story behind the story, but the people who are telling the stories, just their connection to the work they're doing. So I want to say thank you both for making it happen, because diversity in books is needed, and you all are a part of that. So thank you for this time.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
So
And if you have any questions, any questions of those who are watching this later, feel free to put it in the comments, and definitely we look forward to seeing your work continue. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.